The rifle range at Copper Canyon stretched across the desert like a scar carved into red earth, the morning sun casting long shadows between the concrete barriers that separated shooting lanes. The air shimmered with heat mirages even at 8 a.m., and the distant mountains looked like watercolor brushstrokes against a canvas of endless blue sky. Sarah Martinez stood at the entrance gate, her civilian clothes, worn jeans, a faded university t-shirt, and scuffed hiking boots, marking her as an outsider among the tactical gear and camouflage that dominated this space. Her hands trembled slightly as she filled out the waiver, the pen feeling foreign after months of avoiding anything that required steady fingers. The range safety officer, a burly man named Chuck, whose belly strained against his Molon Labe t-shirt, glanced at her driver's license and raised an eyebrow. "First time here?" Chuck asked, his tone carrying that particular mixture of condescension and protective concern that some men reserve for women in traditionally male spaces. Behind him, the sharp crack of rifle fire punctuated the morning air like irregular thunder, each shot echoing off the canyon walls before fading into the desert silence. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The familiar weight of anxiety settled in her chest, that crushing sensation she'd been carrying for the past 18 months. Everything felt too loud, too bright, too much. The smell of gunpowder and hot metal triggered something deep in her memory, not quite a flashback, but the shadow of one, the way storm clouds gather on a distant horizon. "Well, safety first around here," Chuck continued, handing her a pair of yellow foam earplugs and safety glasses. "Keep these on at all times. Red line means cease fire. Nobody moves, nobody breathes until the all clear. We run a tight ship here. You sure you know what you're doing with that rifle case?" The case in question was a battered black Pelican, the kind that had seen serious use. Sarah had carried it from her Honda Civic with the reverent care of someone handling sacred relics. Inside, wrapped in soft foam, lay a rifle that most civilians would never see outside of a museum or movie screen, a military precision instrument that spoke of capabilities far beyond weekend target shooting. "I'll manage," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying just enough edge to make Chuck pause. There was something in her tone, a quality that suggested steel beneath the surface trembling. She signed the waiver with careful precision, each letter formed with a kind of attention to detail that comes from years of documentation under pressure. The range itself was a testament to serious marksmanship. Targets stretched out to 800 yards, with shooting positions ranging from simple concrete benches to elaborate prone stations complete with adjustable rests and wind flags. Most of the shooters clustered at the closer distances, 50 yards, 100 yards, the comfortable ranges where good equipment could compensate for mediocre skill. Sarah walked past them all, her boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the far end of the complex. She stopped at Lane 24, the farthest station from the main building, where the 500-yard targets looked like postage stamps in the distance. The shooting position here was basic, just a concrete pad with a simple wooden bench, but it offered something the others didn't: solitude. As she began unpacking her case, other shooters started to take notice. There was Jake Patterson, a local police instructor, whose arms were covered in military tattoos and whose conversation rarely strayed far from his deployment stories. He was working with a group of younger officers, teaching them the finer points of precision shooting. Next to him stood Maria Rodriguez, the range's only female instructor, whose reputation for outshooting most of the men had earned her both respect and the kind of attention she didn't particularly want. "Never seen her before," Jake muttered, to Maria, nodding toward Sarah. "Think she knows what she's doing with that setup?" Maria watched Sarah's methodical movements, the way she handled each component of her rifle with practiced efficiency, how she checked the scope settings with the kind of automatic precision that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious thought. "Look at her hands," Maria said quietly. "She's not fumbling around. She knows exactly what she's doing." The rifle that emerged from the case was a thing of deadly beauty. A military-grade precision weapon, its stock scarred with the kind of wear that comes from serious use rather than careful range maintenance. The scope was professional-grade glass, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. But it wasn't the equipment that caught Maria's attention.
It was the way Sarah assembled everything with the fluid efficiency of someone who had done this task in conditions where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. Sarah's hand shook as she loaded her first round. The tremor was subtle but noticeable to anyone who knew what to look for. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath that seemed to carry the weight of unseen struggles. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The uncertainty was still there, but it was overshadowed by a deeper current of determination. The first shot rang out like a thunderclap, the sound echoing off the canyon walls with the kind of authority that made everyone within earshot pause their conversations. Through the spotting scope, the target showed a clean hit, dead center of the bullseye. Not just close, perfect center. The kind of shot that most recreational shooters would celebrate for weeks. Jake lowered his binoculars slowly, his expression shifting from casual interest to focused attention. "Lucky shot," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. The second shot followed 30 seconds later, another perfect center hit, placed so precisely that it nearly overlapped the first hole. Then a third, a fourth, each shot placed with mechanical precision, as if Sarah were operating some kind of human targeting computer rather than firing a handheld weapon across 500 yards of desert wind and heat shimmer. By the fifth shot, conversation on the range had died to whispers. By the 10th, a small crowd had gathered behind Sarah's position, their own shooting forgotten in favor of witnessing something extraordinary. The target, when Chuck finally called a ceasefire to check it, showed a single ragged hole in the exact center of the bullseye. 10 shots fired into a group small enough to cover with a quarter. "Holy shit," breathed one of the police officers, his voice carrying the kind of awe typically reserved for witnessing miracles or natural disasters. Sarah stood behind her rifle, her face a mask of controlled emotion. The shaking in her hands had stopped completely during the shooting, replaced by the kind of mechanical steadiness that spoke of intensive training and combat experience. But now, with the immediate task complete, the tremor was returning. She began breaking down her rifle with the same methodical precision she'd used to assemble it, each movement economical and practiced. "Ma'am," Chuck called out as he walked back from the target line, the shot-up bullseye in his hands. "Ma'am, that's some of the finest shooting I've ever seen on this range. Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah paused in her packing, her hands going still on the foam padding of her rifle case. For a moment, the mask slipped, and something raw and painful flickered across her features. "Somewhere else," she said quietly. "A long time ago." The words carried weight, the kind of careful phrasing that suggested stories better left untold. Jake stepped forward, his instructor's eye cataloging details he'd missed before. The way Sarah carried herself, the automatic scan she'd performed when first arriving at the range, the small scars on her knuckles that spoke of serious training and harder experience. "Military?" he asked, his voice gentler than before. Sarah's laugh was bitter, carrying an edge that made several people step back instinctively. "Something like that." She finished packing her rifle and closed the case with a decisive click. "Thank you for the range time." She was walking away before anyone could respond, her boots crunching on the gravel path back toward the parking lot. The group she left behind stood in uncomfortable silence, staring at the target that had been transformed from a simple bullseye into evidence of capabilities that most of them had never seen outside of movies or military demonstrations. Maria Rodriguez was the first to speak. That wasn't recreational shooting. That was something else entirely. Something professional.
Jake nodded, his expression troubled. "Did you see how she handled that rifle? The setup, the shooting position, even the way she controlled her breathing between shots. That's not just military training. That's specialized training, high-level stuff." "But she's shaking," observed one of the younger officers. "Did you see her hands when she wasn't actively shooting? She's dealing with something." Chuck held up the target, studying the impossibly tight group of holes clustered in the exact center of the bullseye. In 30 years of running shooting ranges, he'd never seen civilian shooting this precise. Hell, he'd never seen most military shooters achieve this level of accuracy under ideal conditions. "Whatever she's dealing with," he said slowly, "it's not affecting her ability to put rounds exactly where she wants them." As Sarah's Honda disappeared down the desert road, leaving only a cloud of dust and a growing collection of questions, the people she left behind began to realize they'd witnessed something significant. Not just exceptional marksmanship, but a glimpse into a story that was clearly far from over. The perfect shots, the practiced efficiency, the careful emotional control, it all added up to a mystery wrapped in capability and pain. But mysteries, as Chuck would tell anyone who listened, have a way of revealing themselves when you least expect it. And Sarah Martinez, whether she realized it or not, had just announced her presence in a community that was about to discover exactly what she was running from and what she was capable of when cornered. The desert wind picked up as the morning wore on, carrying with it the lingering echoes of shots that had been far too perfect to be accidental and far too precise to be anything other than the calling card of someone whose story was just beginning to unfold. The questions multiplied throughout that first day. Jake Patterson found himself returning to lane 24 repeatedly, studying the shooting position as if it might yield clues about the woman who had used it with such devastating efficiency. The concrete bench showed no signs of special preparation, no modifications that might explain the extraordinary accuracy he'd witnessed. Yet something about the space felt different now, charged with the memory of performance that transcended ordinary skill. Maria Rodriguez stayed late that evening, long after the other shooters had gone home to their families and their normal lives. She found herself drawn to the target line, walking the 500 yards that separated the shooting position from where Sarah's bullets had clustered with mechanical precision. The distance felt different when covered on foot, longer, more daunting, filled with variables that should have made such accurate shooting nearly impossible. Wind patterns shifted constantly across the desert floor, creating invisible currents that could push a bullet inches off target at this range. Heat mirages rose from the sun-baked earth, distorting vision and making precise aiming a challenge, even for experienced marksmen. The afternoon light created shadows and glare that further complicated the shooting equation. Yet Sarah had cut through all of these variables as if they simply didn't exist, placing shot after shot with the kind of consistency that suggested either extraordinary luck or capabilities that went beyond civilian training. "She knew something we don't," Maria said aloud to the empty range, her voice carrying across the desert stillness. The way she read the wind, the timing of her shots, even the way she positioned herself on that bench, that wasn't learned from books or weekend classes. That was combat experience. Back at the main building, Chuck was fielding phone calls from members who had heard about the morning's demonstration. Word traveled fast in the tight-knit community of serious shooters, and Sarah's performance had already become the stuff of range legend. But with the admiration came questions that Chuck found increasingly difficult to answer. Who was she? Asked Tom Brennan, a retired Marine sniper whose own shooting abilities had earned him respect throughout the Southwest shooting community. "I've been shooting precision rifles for 25 years, and I've never seen anything like what you're describing. 10 shots into one hole at 500 yards? In field conditions? That's not humanly possible unless... Unless what?" Chuck prompted. "Unless she's had training that most of us will never see. Military sniper school, maybe? But even then, what you're describing is beyond what most military snipers achieve in combat conditions. This sounds more like special operations level capability, the kind of shooting that gets people assigned to units that don't officially exist." Chuck was finding himself staring out at lane 24, where the evening light was painting the concrete bench in shades of gold and shadow. She said she learned somewhere else, a long time ago. But Tom, she couldn't have been more than 28 years old. How much training could she have packed into that short a life? "More than you'd think," Tom said grimly. "If she started young, if she was selected for advanced programs, if she saw real combat deployment." "Chuck, what did she look like? I mean, really look like? Not just physically, but how did she carry herself?" The question forced Chuck to examine his memories more carefully. "Alert," he said finally. "Even when she seemed nervous, even when her hands were shaking, she was constantly scanning, checking exits, watching other people's hands, positioning herself where she could see the whole range. And when she was actually shooting..." He paused, struggling to find words for what he'd observed. It was like watching someone slip into a different personality. All the nervousness disappeared. She became this incredibly calm, focused person who could do things that shouldn't be possible. Dissociation, Tom said quietly. It's common in people who've seen serious combat. They learn to compartmentalize, to separate the part of themselves that can function under extreme stress from the part that has to deal with normal human emotions. Chuck, I think you met someone who's been through some very serious shit and is trying to figure out how to live with it. As the sun set over Copper Canyon, painting the desert in shades of amber and crimson, the mystery of Sara Martinez deepened. 3 people, Chuck, Maria, and Jake, found themselves bound together by the shared experience of witnessing something extraordinary, something that raised more questions than it answered. They had seen capability that transcended normal human limits, controlled by someone who was clearly struggling with demons that remained invisible to outside observation. But in small communities, especially communities built around shared interests and mutual respect, mysteries have a way of drawing people together rather than pushing them apart. And whether Sara Martinez realized it or not, her perfect shots had created ripples that would continue expanding, touching lives and revealing truths that she might prefer to keep buried. The desert night settled over the range with the kind of silence that makes some people uncomfortable and others feel at peace. Somewhere out in that darkness, Sara Martinez was dealing with whatever had brought her to seek solace in the familiar weight of a precision rifle and the challenge of placing bullets exactly where she intended them to go. Tomorrow would bring new questions, new challenges, and perhaps the beginning of answers that no one was quite prepared to handle. Sara Martinez lived in a converted garage apartment behind a 1960s ranch house on the outskirts of Copper Ridge, Arizona. The space was sparse, functional, and organized with the kind of military precision that revealed itself in small details. Shoes lined up exactly parallel to the wall, canned goods in the kitchen arranged by size and type, bed made with corners tight enough to bounce quarters. The only decorations were a few photographs, carefully placed but turned face down, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrived despite receiving only the bare minimum of attention. Her morning routine was invariable. Awake at 05:30 hours, regardless of when she'd managed to fall asleep. 20 minutes of stretching and body weight exercises performed in perfect silence, movements flowing with the kind of precision that spoke of years of disciplined practice. Shower at exactly 05:55 hours. Cold water, because the apartment's water heater had been broken for 3 months and she hadn't bothered to have it fixed. Coffee at 06:15 hours. Always black, always consumed while standing at the kitchen counter and staring out the single window that faced the desert. The job that paid her bills was at Morrison's Hardware, a local institution that had been serving Copper Ridge's farming and ranching community for 47 years. Sara worked the morning shift, arriving at 7 a.m. sharp, and spending her days helping customers navigate the maze of fasteners, tools, and agricultural supplies that filled the cavernous store. Her co-workers, mostly older men who'd been with Morrison's for decades, had initially been skeptical of the quiet young woman who'd appeared with perfect references but no local connections. That skepticism had gradually transformed into respectful acceptance as they watched her work.
She knows tools, admitted Bobby Chen, the store's senior sales associate, as he watched Sara help a local rancher select the right drill bits for installing fence posts. Not just the book knowledge, but the practical stuff. How different metals behave, which fasteners work best in desert conditions, even some military applications that most of us have never heard of. The rancher in question, a weathered man named Pete Kowalski, whose family had worked the same land for 3 generations, found himself impressed despite his usual skepticism about outsiders. "You ever work construction?" he asked Sara as she handed him a selection of carbide-tipped bits. "Something like that," Sara replied, the same careful phrasing she used for most personal questions. But she continued with technical details that revealed a depth of knowledge far beyond typical retail experience. "These bits will handle the caliche layer about 3 feet down, but you'll want to pre-drill pilot holes if you're hitting the really hard pan. And use cutting oil. The heat buildup will destroy carbide if you're not careful." Pete nodded appreciatively. Most folks wouldn't know about the caliche. You must be from around here originally. No, Sarah said quietly. Just familiar with desert conditions. The conversation ended there, as most of Sarah's conversations did, with polite deflection that discouraged follow-up questions. But Pete walked away with the distinct impression that he'd been talking to someone who learned about desert drilling conditions under circumstances that had nothing to do with civilian construction projects. Sarah's lunch breaks were spent alone, usually in her Honda in the hardware store parking lot, eating simple sandwiches while reading paperback novels. The books were always the same genre: military thrillers, detective stories, anything with protagonists who faced impossible odds with competence and determination. But her reading was frequently interrupted by moments when she'd suddenly look up, scanning the parking lot with the kind of alertness that suggested she'd heard something that required immediate assessment. "She's always watching," observed Maria Santos, Morrison's bookkeeper, as she noted Sarah's behavior from the office window. "Not paranoid exactly, but like she's expecting something. You ever notice how she positions herself when she's talking to customers? Always with her back to a wall? Always where she can see the exits?" Bobby had noticed, along with other details that painted a picture of someone carrying invisible burdens. Her hands shake sometimes, usually in the morning or when it's quiet, but the minute she starts working with tools, the shaking stops completely. It's like she becomes a different person when she's focused on a task. The truth was that Sarah's life existed in carefully controlled compartments, each one designed to provide structure and purpose while avoiding triggers that might unleash the chaos she worked so hard to contain. Work provided routine and human interaction within safe parameters. The shooting range offered a controlled environment where she could exercise capabilities that demanded expression. Her sparse apartment created a space where she could retreat from the world when the pressure became too much. But compartmentalization, no matter how skillfully managed, required constant energy to maintain. And Sarah was tired, bone deep, soul-weary tired in ways that sleep couldn't cure and rest couldn't heal. The exhaustion showed in small ways. The pause before she answered simple questions, the moment of confusion when someone addressed her by name, the careful way she moved through the world as if conserving energy for battles that might come without warning. Her evenings were spent in solitude, usually reading or performing maintenance on equipment that most civilians would never need to maintain. The rifle that had so impressed the shooters at Copper Canyon was only one of several items that received regular attention. There were other cases in her apartment, locked and secured, containing tools and equipment that spoke of capabilities she'd never discussed with her coworkers at Morrison Hardware. But the most revealing aspect of Sarah's daily routine was something that happened every night at exactly 11 p.m. She would stand at her kitchen window, coffee cup in hand, and stare out at the desert darkness for exactly 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, her carefully maintained composure would crack just slightly, allowing glimpses of pain and loss that she kept buried during daylight hours. Sometimes she would whisper names into the darkness, names that belonged to people who were no longer there to answer. Sometimes she would simply stand in silence, her reflection ghostly in the window glass, looking like someone keeping vigil for the dead. And sometimes, when the weight of memory became too much to bear alone, she would allow herself to cry, silent tears that fell without acknowledgement, as if even grief needed to be contained within acceptable parameters. "Maria," she would whisper to the darkness. "Tommy. Jackson. I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry." These were the only times Sarah allowed herself to use profanity. The only moments when her careful control slipped enough to reveal the raw pain underneath. The names belonged to people who had mattered, people whose absence created holes in her life that no amount of routine or purpose could fill. But dawn always came, bringing with it the need to reconstruct the barriers that kept her functional. And Sarah would face each new day with the same determined precision that characterized everything else she did.
At Morrison's Hardware, she became known for her ability to solve complex problems and her willingness to help customers with projects that went beyond simple retail transactions. A local veteran named Carlos Mendez brought in a collection of old military equipment that needed cleaning and restoration. Sarah spent her lunch breaks helping him identify components and suggesting restoration techniques that revealed familiarity with equipment that shouldn't have been available to civilians. "You know this gear," Carlos observed, as Sarah examined a piece of communications equipment that had seen hard use in desert conditions. "I mean, really know it, not just from manuals, but from using it." Sarah's hands moved over the equipment with practiced familiarity, checking connections and assessing damage with the kind of expertise that came from field experience rather than classroom training. "It's good equipment," she said non-committally, "built to handle harsh conditions." "This particular model was only used by special operations units," Carlos continued carefully. "I should know. I was Rangers for 8 years. Never saw this equipment outside of joint operations with guys who weren't supposed to exist." The comment hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that neither chose to explore further. Sarah finished her assessment and provided detailed restoration instructions, but her manner had shifted subtly, becoming more guarded and professional. Carlos took the hint and didn't push, but he filed the interaction away as further evidence that Morrison's Hardware had hired someone with a story that went beyond civilian experience. These moments of recognition were becoming more frequent, small encounters that chipped away at Sarah's carefully constructed anonymity. Each one forced her to make choices about how much truth to reveal, how much deflection was necessary, and whether the growing attention might eventually require her to move on to another town, another job, another attempt at building a life that could contain the person she'd been without acknowledging what she'd done. But moving required energy she wasn't sure she possessed, and Copper Ridge had offered her something precious. The possibility of stability, of routine, of days that passed without crisis or decision that might mean the difference between life and death. For someone who'd spent years living on the knife's edge of constant alertness, the mundane challenges of retail work and small-town life felt like luxury rather than limitation. The contradiction was that Sarah's attempts to blend into civilian normalcy were being undermined by the very capabilities that made such blending necessary. Her knowledge revealed itself in casual comments about equipment and techniques. Her training showed in the way she moved, the way she assessed situations, the way she could solve problems that should have been beyond her civilian experience. And her performance at the shooting range had announced capabilities that were impossible to ignore or explain away. As she stood at her window each night, coffee cup warming her hands and desert darkness stretching endlessly beyond the glass, Sarah faced the growing certainty that her carefully constructed new life was approaching a crisis point. The questions were multiplying faster than she could deflect them. The attention was becoming more focused and informed. And the people asking questions were beginning to include individuals whose own experience gave them context for understanding what they were seeing.
Change was coming, whether she wanted it or not. The only question was whether that change would allow her to finally integrate her past with her present, or whether it would force her to abandon another attempt at normal life and disappear into the anonymity of another town, another identity, another collection of lies designed to keep dangerous truths safely buried. But tonight, like every night,
She had 10 minutes to remember the names of people who deserved better than burial in silence. 10 minutes to acknowledge losses that shaped everything she did, even when she couldn't afford to let that grief show in daylight. 10 minutes to be honest about the cost of the capabilities she carried and the choices that had made her someone who could place 10 shots through a single hole at 500 yards while her hands shook from trauma that might never fully heal. Maria, Tommy, Jackson, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, Patel. The litany of names continued, each one carrying weight and pain and responsibility that civilian life couldn't address or resolve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new tests of her ability to maintain the fiction that she was just another small-town hardware store employee whose biggest concern was helping customers select the right fasteners for their weekend projects. But for now, in the darkness and silence of her converted garage apartment, Sarah Martinez allowed herself to be exactly who she was: a survivor carrying the weight of the dead, a warrior trying to learn how to live at peace, a woman whose extraordinary capabilities came with costs that no civilian training manual could ever prepare someone to pay. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when Jake Patterson walked into Morrison's Hardware with an expression that mixed curiosity with concern. Sarah was helping a customer select irrigation fittings when she noticed him browsing the tools section, but his attention wasn't on the merchandise. He was watching her, studying her movements with the kind of professional assessment that made her shoulders tense with recognition. Jake approached the counter after the customer left, carrying a set of drill bits that he clearly didn't need. "Sarah, right?" he said, his tone carefully neutral. "We met at the range last week. Jake Patterson. I run training programs for a local law enforcement." "I remember," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional demeanor while internally cataloging exit routes and potential weapons within reach. The measuring tape on her belt could be used as a garrote. The box cutter in her pocket had a sharp blade. The heavy-duty stapler on the counter could inflict serious damage if used with proper technique. "Find everything you need?" "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about that shooting demonstration you gave us. That was some impressive marksmanship." Jake set the drill bits on the counter but made no move to complete the purchase. "The kind of shooting you demonstrated doesn't come from weekend classes or hunting trips. That's professional-level capability, probably military training. My guess is specialized training, sniper school, maybe advanced marksmanship programs that most people never get access to." Sarah's hands remained steady as she counted his change, but something in her eyes shifted, becoming more alert and dangerous. "You're welcome to guess whatever you'd like. Will there be anything else?" The professional courtesy in her voice carried an edge that made Jake take an instinctive step back. He'd spent enough time around dangerous people to recognize when someone was shifting into combat mode, even when that shift was subtle enough to be invisible to civilian observers. "Look, I'm not trying to cause problems, but talent like yours shouldn't be wasted. If you ever want to put those skills to good use, helping train people who protect this community—"
I said no. Sarah's voice remained quiet, but the words carried finality that cut through the hardware store's ambient noise like a blade. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Jake pocketed his change and drill bits, but lingered at the counter for another moment. "Sarah, if you ever change your mind, or if you ever need to talk to someone who understands what it's like to carry that kind of training, my card's on the community board by the door." He left without another word, but his visit had accomplished something Sarah recognized as tactically significant. It had publicly connected her exceptional shooting with questions about her background. The seed of curiosity he'd planted would grow, drawing more attention and more questions from people whose professional experience gave them context for understanding what they were seeing. Within an hour of Jake's departure, Sarah found herself dealing with a steady stream of customers who seemed unusually interested in conversation. Tom Rodriguez, a local paramedic with military experience, spent 20 minutes discussing different types of trauma supplies while studying Sarah's reactions to medical terminology. Carol Brennan, who ran the town's Veterans Services Office, asked detailed questions about gun cleaning supplies while making casual inquiries about Sarah's background. "You know, we have a pretty active veteran community here," Carol mentioned as Sarah rang up her purchase of gun oil and cleaning patches. "Monthly meetings, social events, support groups for people who are having trouble adjusting to civilian life. You'd be welcome to join us." Sarah recognized the offer as both genuine kindness and intelligence gathering. Carol's professional experience had taught her to identify veterans who were struggling, and Sarah's carefully controlled demeanor clearly triggered those instincts. "Thank you, but I'm not a veteran." "No?" Carol's expression suggested polite skepticism. "Well, the invitation stands regardless. Sometimes people find community in unexpected places." The day continued with similar encounters, each one adding weight to Sarah's growing certainty that her anonymity was rapidly deteriorating. By closing time, she'd been approached by no fewer than 7 customers, whose questions went beyond normal retail interaction. Bobby Chen and Maria Santos had both made casual inquiries about her plans for the weekend. Even Old Man Morrison himself had emerged from his office to make conversation about her impressive technical knowledge. The pressure was building in ways that Sarah recognized from previous experience. When a cover identity began attracting attention, the smart move was immediate extraction. Disappear before questions turned into investigations, before casual interest became focused scrutiny. But something about Copper Ridge felt like failure in ways that previous relocations hadn't. Perhaps it was the genuine kindness she'd encountered, or the sense of community that existed beneath the surface curiosity. Or perhaps she was simply tired of running from connections that might provide the human contact she'd been missing since leaving her previous life behind. The decision to stay, at least for now, came with the recognition that she needed to manage the growing attention rather than simply deflecting it. That evening, Sarah found herself doing something she hadn't done since arriving in Copper Ridge, actively researching the people who were researching her. Jake Patterson's background was easy to verify through public records and social media. 20-year veteran of Army Special Forces, multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, decorated for valor in combat operations. His transition to civilian law enforcement had been successful, earning respect for his ability to train officers in tactics that bridged military and police applications. His interest in Sarah's shooting capabilities was professional rather than personal. He genuinely believed her skills could benefit the community. Carol Brennan's history revealed a woman dedicated to helping veterans transition to civilian life, someone who'd built a reputation for identifying people who needed support before they reached crisis points. Her approach to Sarah was clinical but caring, the intervention of someone who recognized signs of post-combat stress and wanted to help. Tom Rodriguez's military service included deployment as a combat medic, experience that gave him insight into the kind of training that produced people with Sarah's level of competence under pressure.
Assessment of someone who understood that exceptional tactical skills often came with psychological costs that required ongoing management. The pattern that emerged from Sarah's research was both reassuring and concerning. The people showing interest in her background were largely individuals with enough experience to understand what they were seeing, but also enough wisdom to approach her with respect rather than intrusion. They weren't seeking to expose her for malicious reasons. They were recognizing someone who might benefit from community connection rather than continued isolation. But understanding their motivations didn't eliminate the security risks that their attention represented. Each person who correctly identified Sarah's background was a potential breach of the operational security that kept her safe from people who might have very different reasons for wanting to locate someone with her capabilities and knowledge. The next morning brought escalation in the form of Chuck Wilson from the shooting range, accompanied by a man Sarah didn't recognize but whose bearing immediately identified him as military or former military. They entered Morrison's Hardware during the morning rush, when the store was filled with contractors and ranchers picking up supplies for daily work. The presence of multiple witnesses limited their options for private conversation, but also meant that whatever they discussed would be observed and remembered by people who were already curious about Sarah's story. "Sarah," Chuck called out as she helped a customer load concrete mixing supplies. "Got a minute? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Sarah finished with her customer before approaching the two men, her movements careful and controlled. The stranger was studying her with professional assessment that went beyond casual interest. Mid-50s, graying hair kept in military regulation style, bearing that suggested command experience rather than simple service. His casual civilian clothes couldn't disguise the alertness in his posture or the way his eyes cataloged tactical considerations even in the mundane environment of a hardware store. "Sarah Martinez?" said Chuck. "This is Colonel Marcus Wright, retired Marine Corps. He was visiting the range yesterday, heard about your shooting demonstration, and wanted to meet you." Colonel Wright extended his hand with the kind of measured courtesy that suggested both respect and evaluation. "Miss Martinez, Chuck tells me you put on quite a display of marksmanship. Impressive shooting for civilian conditions." Sarah accepted the handshake while noting the calluses and small scars that marked Wright as someone who'd spent serious time with weapons and equipment. "Just target practice," she replied, keeping her voice neutral. Wright's grip was firm, but not aggressive, the contact of someone accustomed to evaluating people through physical interaction. 10 shots through one hole at 500 yards isn't just target practice, Miss Martinez. That's precision shooting at a level that requires very specific training, the kind of training that comes from institutions most civilians never see. The conversation was attracting attention from other customers and employees. Bobby Chen had abandoned any pretense of working and was openly listening. Maria Santos stood near the office door, clearly monitoring the situation. Even customers who didn't know Sarah personally were pausing their shopping to observe an interaction that carried obvious tension beneath its surface politeness. "Sarah," Chuck called out as she helped a customer load concrete mixing supplies. "Got a minute? There's someone I'd like you to meet." Sarah finished with her customer before approaching the two men, her movements careful and controlled. The stranger was studying her with professional assessment that went beyond casual interest. Mid-50s, graying hair kept in military regulation style, bearing that suggested command experience rather than simple service. His casual civilian clothes couldn't disguise the alertness in his posture or the way his eyes cataloged tactical considerations even in the mundane environment of a hardware store. "Sarah Martinez," said Chuck. "This is Colonel Marcus Wright, retired Marine Corps. He was visiting the range yesterday, heard about your shooting demonstration, and wanted to meet you."
Of course, but circumstances change, and it's always good to know that opportunities exist. Wright reached into his jacket pocket, a movement that made Sarah's muscles tense until he withdrew only a business card. "In case you ever want to explore possibilities that might make better use of your talents." The card was simple white stock with only a name and phone number, no company identification, no address, no indication of what kind of opportunities might be available. Sarah accepted it with the kind of careful attention she might give to a live explosive device. "We should let you get back to work," Chuck said, clearly sensing the tension that had developed between Sarah and Wright. "Thanks for your time, Sarah." The two men left without purchasing anything, their visit having accomplished its primary purpose of establishing contact and delivering Wright's business card. But their departure didn't reduce the attention their visit had generated. If anything, it intensified the curiosity of everyone who'd witnessed the interaction. "Who was that guy?" Bobby Chen asked as soon as the door closed behind them. "And what kind of opportunities was he talking about?" Sarah pocketed the business card without examining it further. "I have no idea. Probably some kind of sales position." But her deflection convinced no one, least of all Bobby, whose own military experience had taught him to recognize recruitment approaches when he saw them. Sarah, that wasn't a sales recruiter. That was military or intelligence, someone with serious backing and specific interest in your capabilities. You're imagining things, Sarah said, but her voice carried strain that made the denial unconvincing. The rest of the morning passed in an atmosphere of heightened tension and whispered speculation. Customers and employees alike were processing what they'd witnessed, trying to understand why a retired Marine colonel would make a special trip to recruit a hardware store employee. The most obvious answer, that Sarah's background included capabilities that warranted such attention, raised questions that no one was quite ready to ask directly. By lunchtime, Sarah found herself facing a choice that would determine the trajectory of her immediate future. She could continue deflecting questions and hoping the attention would fade. But Colonel Wright's visit had escalated the situation beyond the point where simple denial would be effective. Or she could begin sharing selected truths, controlling the narrative rather than allowing others to construct their own theories about her background and capabilities. The decision was made for her when Maria Santos approached during her lunch break, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd reached conclusions that required discussion. "Sarah, we need to talk." "About what?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "About who you really are, what you're running from, and whether this community can help you instead of making things worse." Maria handed her one of the coffee cups and waited for Sarah's response. The question hung in the desert air between them, weighted with implications that went far beyond simple curiosity. Maria Santos wasn't asking for entertainment or gossip. She was offering the kind of direct confrontation that might lead to either trust or immediate departure. And Sarah, tired from months of deflection and isolation, found herself at the precise moment where she had to choose between continued secrecy and the possibility of genuine human connection. "What makes you think I'm running from anything?" Sarah asked, stalling for time while she evaluated her options. "Because I've seen that look before. My brother came back from Afghanistan with the same expression, hyper-alert, constantly scanning for threats, jumping at unexpected sounds. And because hardware store employees don't usually receive recruitment visits from retired Marine colonels who hand out business cards with no company information."
Maria's observation was accurate enough to make denial pointless. "Your brother, how is he now?" "Better. It took time, therapy, and a lot of support from people who understood what he'd been through, but he's building a life that works for him." Maria studied Sarah's profile as she stared out at the desert landscape. "The thing is, isolation makes everything harder. Community can help if you let it." "And if the community decides I'm too much trouble? If my problems are bigger than small-town friendship can handle? Then we deal with that when it happens. But Sarah, you've been here for what, 6 months? In that time, you've helped dozens of people with problems they couldn't solve themselves. You've been reliable, professional, and kind. Whatever you did before, whatever brought you here, this community has already decided you're worth caring about." The sincerity in Maria's voice was almost more difficult to handle than suspicion or fear would have been. Sarah had prepared for rejection, investigation, even attempts at exploitation. She hadn't prepared for genuine offer of support from people who were asking nothing in return except honesty about whether they could help. "It's complicated," Sarah said finally. "Most important things are, but complicated doesn't mean impossible." Maria checked her watch and realized their lunch break was nearly over. "Think about it, Sarah. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it alone." The afternoon brought new visitors to Morrison's Hardware, but these arrivals carried different energy than the morning's recruitment attempt. Tom Rodriguez stopped by to purchase medical supplies, but spent most of his time making casual conversation about the challenges of transitioning military medical training to civilian applications. Carol Brennan arrived with pamphlets about veteran support services, though she didn't pressure Sarah to take them. Even Jake Patterson returned, this time accompanied by Maria Rodriguez from the shooting range. "We're organizing a community barbecue this weekend," Jake announced to the store in general, but his attention was focused on Sarah. "Thought you might like to join us. Good food, good people, no pressure." "Just a chance to be part of something," Maria Rodriguez added.
if you're interested." Sarah found herself surrounded by invitations and offers of inclusion, each one carefully crafted to avoid pressure while making clear that community membership was available if she wanted it. The attention was overwhelming in ways that tactical situations had never been. There were no clear responses to kindness, no standard operating procedures for dealing with people who wanted to help rather than exploit or investigate. But Colonel Wright's business card remained in her pocket, a reminder that not all attention was benevolent. Someone with resources and authority had identified her as a person of interest, and that kind of attention rarely remained casual for long. The recruitment approach suggested that her capabilities had been assessed and found valuable enough to warrant direct contact. Whether that represented opportunity or threat would depend on factors beyond her control. The day ended with Sarah facing a decision that would shape everything that followed. She could accept the community's offers of inclusion and risk the exposure that came with deeper connections. She could maintain her current level of careful isolation while hoping that outside interest would fade. Or she could implement immediate extraction, disappearing from Copper Ridge before the situation developed beyond her ability to control. But as she stood at her kitchen window that night, coffee cup warming her hands and desert darkness stretching endlessly beyond the glass, Sarah realized that the choice might have already been made for her. The community had seen her capabilities and responded with offers of support rather than demands for explanation. The attention from outside interests had identified her as someone worth recruiting rather than someone who needed to be contained or eliminated. For the first time since leaving her previous life, Sarah faced the possibility that her past might be an asset rather than a liability, that her capabilities might be valued rather than feared, and that the community she tried so hard to blend into might actually benefit from knowing who she really was.
But with possibility came risk, and Sarah's training had taught her that the greatest dangers often came disguised as opportunities. Colonel Wright's business card represented interests that went far beyond local community support, and accepting his opportunities might mean returning to a world she'd worked so hard to leave behind. The names she whispered to the darkness that night carried different weight than usual. Maria, Tommy, Jackson, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, Patel. Each name belonged to someone who'd trusted her with their lives, someone who'd paid the price for her decisions and capabilities. The question now was whether accepting help from the people of Copper Ridge would honor that trust or betray it by exposing them to dangers they couldn't understand or prepare for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new tests of her ability to balance the needs of her past with the possibilities of her future. But tonight, for the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself to consider the revolutionary possibility that she might not have to make that choice alone. The escalation accelerated the following day when Sarah arrived at Morrison's Hardware to find a black SUV parked across the street with two occupants who weren't making any effort to hide their surveillance. The vehicle's government plates and the obvious tactical positioning of its passengers sent a clear message. Someone with authority was taking more than casual interest in her activities. Bobby Chen noticed her reaction immediately. "Friends of yours?" he asked, following her gaze to the SUV. "No," Sarah replied, her voice tight with tension. "Definitely not friends." The morning progressed with the uncomfortable awareness that everything she did was being observed and potentially recorded. The surveillance team rotated vehicles twice, maintaining continuous coverage while demonstrating resources that went far beyond local law enforcement capabilities. By noon, Sarah was functioning in full operational mode, constantly aware of exits, positioning herself to minimize exposure, evaluating every customer and interaction for potential threats.
The situation came to a head when Colonel Wright returned, this time without Chuck Wilson and accompanied by a woman in a dark business suit whose bearings screamed federal authority. They entered during the lunch rush when the store was crowded with contractors and local residents, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from casual commerce to something that felt far more serious. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Wright said, approaching the counter with his companion, "I'd like you to meet Special Agent Jennifer Walsh from the Department of Defense. She has some questions that might be better discussed in private." Agent Walsh stepped forward, her credentials already in hand. "Miss Martinez, we need to discuss your background and certain capabilities that have come to our attention. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Sarah's mind raced through tactical assessments and escape routes while maintaining surface calm. The presence of federal agents meant that her identity had been compromised at levels that couldn't be deflected or denied. Someone with access to classified databases had identified her, and the opportunities that Wright had mentioned were likely to be significantly less voluntary than his initial approach had suggested. "I'm working. If you have questions, you can contact me through normal channels." "Miss Martinez, this isn't a request. We have information about your previous activities that requires immediate discussion." The confrontation was playing out in front of dozens of witnesses, including several people who'd already shown personal interest in Sarah's welfare. Bobby Chen was positioning himself closer to the counter, his own military training evident in his alert posture. Maria Santos had emerged from the office, clearly prepared to support Sarah whatever that might require. Even customers who didn't know her personally were beginning to recognize that something significant was happening.
"Sarah," Bobby said quietly, "you don't have to go anywhere with them without legal representation." Agent Walsh turned her attention to Bobby with the kind of cold assessment that federal agents reserved for potential obstacles. "Sir, this is a matter of national security. I'd advise you to stay out of it." "National security?" Maria Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the indignation of someone who'd spent years advocating for people who couldn't advocate for themselves. What national security issue could possibly involve a hardware store employee? The question hung in the air, crystallizing the fundamental contradiction that had been building for days. Sarah's capabilities clearly exceeded anything that civilian employment would explain, but the federal attention seemed disproportionate to whatever threat a single individual might pose. Unless, of course, her background included elements that went far beyond what anyone in Copper Ridge had imagined. Colonel Wright attempted to de-escalate the situation. "Perhaps we could step outside, avoid disrupting Ms. Martinez's workplace." "No." Sarah's voice cut through the discussion with quiet finality. "If you have questions, ask them here, in front of witnesses." The statement was tactically risky, but strategically sound. Public confrontation would limit the federal agent's options for coercion, while ensuring that whatever information emerged would be witnessed by people who had already demonstrated concern for her welfare. If she was going to be exposed, better to control the circumstances rather than allowing it to happen in isolation, where her version of events might never be heard. Agent Walsh exchanged glances with Colonel Wright before making a decision that would change everything. "Very well. Miss Martinez, we're here to invite you to join a team conducting high-level intelligence operations. You have a reputation for technical expertise and tactical soundness." The question landed like a bombshell in the crowded hardware store. Conversations stopped as customers and employees processed the implications of federal agents discussing military special operations in connection with the quiet woman who'd been helping them select fasteners and tools for 6 months. Sarah's response came after a long moment of silence. "That was a long time ago." "Not that long," Agent Walsh continued. "And certain skills don't fade with time.
We have reports of shooting demonstrations that suggest your capabilities remain at operational levels." Bobby Chen's expression shifted as he processed this information. MARSOC was elite military, the kind of unit that produced individuals with capabilities that went far beyond standard military training. If Sarah had served with Marine Special Operations Command, her technical knowledge and situational awareness suddenly made complete sense. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the exposure of information she'd worked months to keep private. "We want to offer you a chance to serve your country again," Colonel Wright said. "There are situations developing that require people with your specific skill set and experience." "And if I'm not interested?" Agent Walsh's smile was cold and professional. "Miss Martinez, people with your background and capabilities have ongoing obligations to national security. Those obligations don't end with discharge from active duty." The threat was clear enough to make several customers step closer to the counter, their body language shifting from curious observation to protective positioning. Sarah had earned genuine affection and respect from the Copper Ridge community, and federal agents threatening one of their own was triggering responses that went beyond mere curiosity. "Now wait just a minute," Pete Kowalski interrupted, his weathered face flushed with anger. "You government people can't just walk into our town and start threatening folks. Sarah's been nothing but helpful and professional since she got here."
"Sir, this doesn't concern you," Agent Walsh replied. "The hell it doesn't. Sarah's part of this community, and we take care of our own." Pete's statement was echoed by murmurs of agreement from the other customers, their support creating a buffer of civilian protection that the federal agents couldn't simply dismiss. Colonel Wright recognized the deteriorating tactical situation and attempted to regain control. "Miss Martinez, perhaps we could discuss this at a more appropriate time and place. My card has all the necessary contact information." "She already told you no," Bobby Chen said firmly. "I think it's time for you to leave." The confrontation was reaching a point where federal agents would either need to escalate significantly or accept temporary defeat. Agent Walsh clearly wanted to press the issue, but the growing crowd of hostile civilians and the public nature of the confrontation made aggressive action politically risky. "Miss Martinez," Agent Walsh said finally, "this conversation isn't over. We'll be in touch." The federal agents left without another word, but their departure didn't reduce the tension that had filled Morrison Hardware. Sarah found herself surrounded by people whose previous curiosity had transformed into protective concern. Their questions no longer about her background, but about her safety and well-being. "MARSOC," Bobby said quietly, his voice carrying respect and understanding. "Jesus, Sarah, no wonder you know equipment and tactics the way you do. Is that why you came here? To get away from that kind of pressure?" Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who'd shown up to work or shop for mundane supplies but found themselves witnesses to a confrontation that revealed capabilities and connections they'd never imagined. Their expressions showed concern rather than fear, support rather than suspicion. "It's complicated," she said finally, using the same phrase she'd offered Maria the day before. "Most important things are," Pete Kowalski replied, unknowingly echoing Maria's earlier words. "But Sarah, you've helped every one of us with something at one time or another. Whatever those government folks want, they're going to have to go through all of us to get it." The declaration was met with nods and murmurs of agreement that transformed Sarah's isolation into community protection. For the first time since Colonel Wright's initial approach, she felt something approaching safety. Not the tactical security that came from weapons and training, but the human security that came from belonging to something larger than herself. But federal attention rarely faded without resolution, and Sarah knew that Agent Walsh's parting words represented a promise rather than a threat.
The investigation would continue, the pressure would increase, and eventually she would face choices that might force her to choose between the community that had embraced her and the government that claimed ongoing authority over her life. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors who weren't customers but community members checking on Sarah's well-being. Jake Patterson arrived with legal referrals and offers of support. Carol Brennan brought information about veteran advocacy resources that might help resist federal pressure. Tom Rodriguez offered medical support if stress or anxiety became overwhelming. "We're not just going to stand by and watch them intimidate you," Jake said firmly. "This community has resources, connections, people who understand how to fight government overreach." But even as the support surrounded her, Sarah recognized the fundamental problem that federal attention represented. Her presence in Copper Ridge was now compromised beyond repair. Agent Walsh and Colonel Wright knew exactly where to find her, and their resources made hiding or running significantly more difficult than it had been before. More importantly, their attention put anyone who supported her at potential risk. Federal investigations had ways of expanding to include anyone who appeared to be obstructing official inquiries. The people offering help and protection might find themselves facing scrutiny that could damage their own lives and careers.
That evening, Sarah stood at her kitchen window for longer than her usual 10 minutes, wrestling with decisions that would affect not just her own future, but the safety and well-being of people who'd offered friendship without asking for anything in return. The desert darkness seemed more oppressive than usual, filled with possibilities that ranged from continued community integration to forced return to a world she'd worked so hard to leave behind. Colonel Wright's business card lay on her kitchen counter, representing choices she didn't want to make. Agent Walsh's words echoed in her memory, carrying implications of obligations that might override personal preferences. But surrounding these threats was the new reality of community support, people who demonstrated willingness to stand between her and forces they didn't fully understand. The names she whispered that night included new additions: Maria, Tommy, Jackson, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, Patel, Bobby, Maria Santos, Pete, Jake, Carol, Tom. The list had grown to include people who were still alive, still present, still offering the kind of connection that might make fighting worthwhile rather than simply running again. But whether that fight could be won and what it might cost the people brave enough to stand with her remained questions that would require answers Sarah wasn't sure she was qualified to provide. The revelation came 3 days later, not through federal investigation or military records, but through the careful research of Maria Santos, who possessed the patient thoroughness of someone accustomed to navigating bureaucratic mazes to help veterans in crisis. What she discovered in declassified mission reports and casualty databases would transform Sarah Martinez from mysterious hardware store employee into something approaching legend. Maria had spent her weekend diving into public records, cross-referencing deployment schedules and unit citations with the timeline of Sarah's apparent service. The breakthrough came when she found a heavily redacted after-action report from a mission designated Operation Desert Sage, conducted 18 months earlier in a location that remained classified. The report mentioned a MARSOC sniper team that had provided overwatch and target elimination during a hostage rescue that saved 14 civilian contractors from terrorist execution. The survivor's name was redacted, but the description of wounds sustained during the mission included details that matched scars Maria had noticed on Sarah's hands and neck. More tellingly, the psychological evaluation noted severe survivor guilt and post-traumatic stress requiring extensive therapy and potential medical retirement. Maria stared at the computer screen in her home office, trying to process the implications of what she'd discovered. The quiet woman who helped customers select the right drill bits for their projects had apparently survived a mission that killed 3 teammates while accomplishing objectives that saved 14 civilian lives.
The capabilities she demonstrated at the shooting range weren't just military training. They were combat-proven skills maintained by someone who'd used them under conditions where failure meant death for herself and others. The decision to share this information wasn't made lightly. Maria understood that Sarah's privacy had been deliberately constructed to protect her from exactly this kind of exposure. But Agent Walsh's threats and Colonel Wright's opportunities suggested that Sarah's attempt at anonymity was already compromised beyond repair. The question was whether community knowledge of her true background would provide protection or create additional vulnerability. Monday morning brought Maria to Morrison's Hardware with printed copies of the declassified reports, her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd uncovered truths that demanded careful handling. She found Sarah stocking shelves in the back of the store, moving with the mechanical precision that had become more pronounced since the federal agent's visit. "Sarah, we need to talk. I found something you need to see." Sarah's hand stilled on the box of fasteners she'd been organizing. "What kind of something?" "The kind that explains why federal agents are interested in recruiting you and why your shooting demonstration impressed people as much as it did." Maria held up the papers with careful reverence. "Operation Desert Sage. Ring any bells?"
The box of fasteners slipped from Sarah's hands, scattering stainless steel screws across the concrete floor with metallic rain that seemed unnaturally loud in the store's morning quiet. Her face went pale, then flushed with an emotion that mixed recognition with something approaching panic. "Where did you get that?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "Public records, mostly redacted, but enough detail to piece together what happened. Sarah, you saved 14 lives. You survived something that killed 3 of your teammates. You carried classified material through hostile territory while wounded." Maria's voice carried awe mixed with understanding. "No wonder you have nightmares. No wonder your hands shake. No wonder you can put 10 shots through one hole at 500 yards. Sarah knelt to collect the scattered fasteners, her movements sharp and agitated. "You don't understand what you're reading. Those reports don't tell the whole story." "Then tell me the whole story. Help me understand why you think you're running from something instead of being proud of what you accomplished." The conversation was interrupted by Bobby Chen's approach, his expression showing concern at the tension he'd observed from across the store. "Everything okay back here?" Maria made a quick decision that would prove pivotal. "Bobby, you need to see this. We all need to understand what we're dealing with." She handed him the printed reports, watching his expression change as he processed the details of Operation Desert Sage. Bobby's own military experience gave him context for understanding the significance of what Sarah had accomplished and survived. "Jesus Christ," Bobby breathed, looking from the papers to Sarah with new understanding. "You were the lone survivor of a sniper team. You held off an entire terrorist cell while carrying wounded out of hostile territory." "I got my team killed," Sarah said flatly, her voice carrying pain that made both Maria and Bobby step back instinctively. "I made the call that put us in that position. I'm the reason Maria Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and Jackson Williams are dead instead of home with their families." The names she'd been whispering to the darkness every night for 18 months suddenly carried context that transformed private grief into shared understanding. These weren't random casualties of war. They were teammates whose deaths Sarah had carried as personal responsibility, whose memory drove her to seek isolation rather than recognition. Bobby's military experience provided framework for understanding survivor guilt and the psychological aftermath of combat losses. "Sarah, you know that's not how it works. You know that mission success and casualty rates aren't determined by individual decisions. You saved 14 civilians and completed the mission objectives. I should have anticipated the compromise, should have identified the security weakness that got them killed. Should have been psychic." Maria interrupted, her voice carrying the firm compassion of someone who'd helped many veterans process similar guilt. "Sarah, you survived something that 90% of people wouldn't have lived through. You accomplished objectives that saved lives and prevented a terrorist propaganda victory. That's not failure, that's extraordinary success under impossible conditions." The discussion was attracting attention from other employees and early customers, their conversations creating a growing circle of people who were beginning to understand the true scope of Sarah's background and capabilities. Word of the declassified report spread through the store with the speed that significant news achieves in small communities, transforming Sarah's carefully maintained anonymity into community knowledge. Jake Patterson arrived within an hour, having been contacted by Bobby with news that demanded immediate attention. His expression when he read the mission reports showed the kind of professional respect that one warrior reserves for another who'd proven herself under ultimate pressure. "Sarah," Jake said simply, "this changes everything. You're not just a veteran trying to adjust to civilian life. You're a certified hero who deserves recognition rather than federal harassment."
"I'm not a hero," Sarah replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Heroes don't get their teams killed. Heroes make impossible decisions under conditions where any choice might be wrong, then live with the consequences while accomplishing objectives that save other people's lives." Jake's words carried the authority of someone who'd faced similar decisions and understood their weight. What you did in Desert Sage wasn't just survival, it was leadership under pressure that most people can't imagine. By noon, Morrison's Hardware had become an unofficial command center for community response to Sarah's situation. The declassified reports were being copied and distributed, creating a paper trail of documented heroism that countered any narrative of federal agents recruiting a potentially dangerous individual. Carol Brennan arrived with veterans' rights attorneys willing to provide pro bono representation. Tom Rodriguez brought medical documentation that supported the legitimacy of Sarah's post-combat stress and her need for civilian transition support. "This is what we needed," Carol announced to the growing group of Sarah supporters. "Documentation that proves she's not a security risk, but a decorated veteran who deserves community protection rather than federal pressure." But the attention was overwhelming Sarah in ways that tactical situations never had. Being surrounded by people discussing her classified missions and combat decorations felt more invasive than Agent Walsh's threats or Colonel Wright's recruitment attempts. The careful barriers she'd constructed between her past and present were collapsing, forcing her to confront aspects of her service that she'd worked hard to bury. "I need some air," Sarah announced suddenly, walking toward the store's rear exit with quick steps that bordered on retreat. Maria followed, finding Sarah in the alley behind Morrison Hardware, leaning against the building's brick wall and breathing deeply of the desert air. The early morning sun was already fierce, but Sarah seemed to find the heat comforting rather than oppressive. "Too much? Too fast?" Maria asked gently. "I came here to forget, to build a life where those missions and those decisions didn't matter anymore. Now everyone knows exactly what I've done and why I can't sleep at night." "But Sarah, hiding from your service record means hiding from the respect and support you've earned. The people in there aren't looking at you as someone damaged or dangerous. They're looking at you as someone who deserves their protection and admiration. What if that protection puts them at risk? What if Agent Walsh decides that community support constitutes obstruction of federal investigation? What if you let us worry about the what-ifs, while you focus on deciding what kind of life you want to build here?" Maria's interruption was gentle but firm. "You've spent 18 months carrying responsibility for things that were beyond your control. Maybe it's time to let other people share that load." The conversation was interrupted by Jake Patterson's appearance in the alley, his expression carrying news that would require immediate attention. "Sarah, we've got a problem. Chuck Wilson just called from the range. There are federal agents there with a warrant, searching the records and confiscating the target you shot last week." The escalation meant that Sarah's shooting demonstration was now evidence in some kind of federal investigation. Her moment of revealed capability transformed into legal justification for expanded scrutiny. The community's protective response had triggered federal countermeasures that could easily expand to include anyone who appeared to be supporting her. "I should leave," Sarah said, recognizing the tactical situation developing around her. "Before this gets worse, before more people get dragged into whatever the feds are building." "No," Jake said firmly.
Running now would be admitting guilt you don't have while abandoning people who are willing to stand with you. Sarah, we've seen what you're capable of. We know what you've accomplished. This community has decided you're worth fighting for, and we don't abandon our own."
The words carried weight that went beyond simple friendship or community solidarity. Sarah had demonstrated capabilities that could protect the people who were now offering to protect her. Skills that made her valuable not just as a community member, but as someone who could contribute to collective security in ways that ordinary civilians couldn't match. "What if they're right?" Sarah asked quietly. "What if I do have ongoing obligations to national security? What if my skills are needed for missions that could save lives?" The question exposed the fundamental conflict that Agent Walsh and Colonel Wright had been exploiting. Sarah's capabilities were undeniably valuable for national security purposes, and her previous service had proven her effectiveness under extreme conditions. The moral weight of potentially withholding those capabilities from situations where they might prevent terrorist attacks or save civilian lives created pressure that simple resistance to federal authority couldn't address. "Then we help you make that decision on your terms, not under threat or coercion, but as a choice made by someone who understands the full scope of her options and consequences." Jake nodded agreement. "Sarah, you've proven yourself under conditions where most people would have died or failed. You've earned the right to determine how and when your capabilities are used. But you've also earned support from people who understand what you've sacrificed and what you continue to carry." The afternoon brought new developments that would test the community's resolve and Sarah's willingness to trust in collective protection. Agent Walsh returned with additional personnel and legal documentation that expanded the federal investigation beyond simple recruitment to include questions about Sarah's current activities and associations. But this time, the federal agents found themselves facing not just Sarah's individual resistance, but organized community opposition that included legal representation, media attention, and political support from elected officials who were beginning to understand the implications of federal harassment of a decorated veteran. The battle lines were drawn, and Sarah Martinez found herself at the center of a conflict that would determine not just her own future, but the principle of whether communities could protect their members from federal overreach, and whether individual sacrifice in service to the country earned the right to choose one's own path in civilian life. The names she would whisper that night had grown to include everyone willing to stand between her and forces that would conscript her capabilities without regard for her personal needs or desires. But whether that protection could withstand federal pressure and what price her defenders might pay for their loyalty remained questions that would require answers in the days to come. The turning point came when Congressman David Harrison, a former Marine himself, received a phone call from Carol Brennan about federal agents harassing a decorated veteran in his district. Harrison's initial response was routine political courtesy, but his tone shifted dramatically when Carol provided details about Operation Desert Sage and Sarah's service record. "You're telling me that federal agents are pressuring a MARSOC veteran who survived a classified mission that saved 14 civilian lives?" Harrison's voice carried the kind of anger that veteran advocates learn to recognize and appreciate. "And they're threatening her with consequences if she doesn't accept recruitment for missions she's not obligated to perform?" Within 24 hours, Harrison's office had requested all documentation related to Agent Walsh's investigation and Colonel Wright's recruitment efforts. The congressman's military background gave him both the clearance to access classified details about Operation Desert Sage and the political influence to question why a decorated veteran was being subjected to coercive recruitment rather than being offered appropriate support for post-combat trauma. Sarah learned about Harrison's intervention when Bobby Chen approached her at work with a copy of the congressman's press release, his expression mixing relief with vindication. "Look at this," he said, spreading the paper on Morrison's counter.
Harrison's calling for a full investigation into improper recruiting practices and veteran harassment.
The press release was carefully worded, but its implications were clear. Congressman Harrison was using his position to challenge federal agencies that appeared to be violating protocols for veteran support and voluntary service. More importantly, he was doing so with specific reference to Sarah's case, creating political cover that would make further harassment significantly more difficult. "This means they can't just disappear you or pressure you into service," Maria Santos said, reading over Bobby's shoulder. "Harrison's made this a public issue with political oversight." But Sarah's response was more cautious than her supporters expected. "This also means my name and service record are going to become public information. Everything I've tried to keep private will be in newspapers and government reports." "Would that be so terrible?" asked Jake Patterson, who'd arrived in time to hear the conversation. "Sarah, you've spent 18 months hiding from recognition you earned and deserve. Maybe it's time to let people know who you really are." The question forced Sarah to confront the fundamental choice she'd been avoiding since arriving in Copper Ridge. She could continue attempting to hide from her past, knowing that federal attention and community knowledge made such hiding increasingly impossible. Or she could accept the reality that her service record would become public and focus on building a future that integrated her capabilities with her civilian aspirations. The decision was made easier by what happened next. Tom Rodriguez burst through Morrison's front door with news that changed everything. "Turn on the radio. Harrison's doing a live interview about veteran rights and federal overreach. He's talking about Sarah's case specifically." Bobby reached for the radio behind the counter, tuning to the local news station where Congressman Harrison's voice filled the hardware store with words that would reshape Sarah's entire situation. "The young woman we're discussing today represents the best of American military service. She volunteered for dangerous missions, survived combat that killed 3 of her teammates, and accomplished objectives that saved 14 civilian lives. She earned the right to choose her own path in civilian life, not to be harassed by federal agents who want to conscript her capabilities for missions she's not obligated to perform." The interviewer pressed for details. "Congressman, are you saying that federal agencies are improperly recruiting veterans?" "I'm saying that decorated veterans who've already given more than their fair share deserve support, not coercion. The young woman in question is dealing with post-combat trauma while trying to build a productive civilian life. She should be receiving medical care and community support, not recruitment visits from agents who seem to believe that extraordinary military service creates permanent obligation to government demands." The interview continued for another 10 minutes, with Harrison fielding questions about veteran support services, federal recruitment practices, and the specific protections that decorated veterans should receive when transitioning to civilian life. Each answer reinforced the message that Sarah's case represented broader issues affecting military veterans who'd served with distinction but needed space and support to heal from combat trauma. When the interview ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by people whose expressions showed a mixture of pride, vindication, and protective determination. Her secret was no longer secret, but the revelation had come in the form of advocacy rather than exposure, recognition rather than exploitation. "How do you feel about that?" Maria asked gently.
Sarah considered the question while processing the new reality that her service record was now public knowledge, her survival of Operation Desert Sage a matter of congressional testimony rather than personal secret. Terrified, she admitted, but also relieved. "I'm tired of hiding from things I can't change." The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to Morrison's hardware, but these weren't customers seeking tools and supplies. Veterans from throughout the region arrived to meet the MARSOC survivor, whose story had become public advocacy for their own struggles with post-combat transition. Each conversation added weight to Sarah's understanding that her individual experience represented broader challenges facing many people who'd served in classified operations. "I was Delta Force," confided a quiet man named Steve Kowalski, Pete's nephew who'd recently returned from deployment. "Different missions, Same aftermath. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, the feeling like civilian life doesn't make sense anymore. I've been struggling with whether to accept contract work that would use my skills but take me away from the life I'm trying to build here. Navy SEAL, added another visitor, a woman named Jennifer Hayes, whose presence demonstrated that elite military service crossed all demographic boundaries. 3 tours, multiple classified operations, medical retirement for PTSD. I've been hiding in a cabin outside Phoenix, avoiding human contact because I couldn't figure out how to be around people who don't understand what combat actually costs. By evening, Morrison's Hardware had become an impromptu support group for special operations veterans who'd found courage in Sarah's public story to share their own struggles with civilian transition. The conversations were raw, honest, and healing in ways that formal therapy had failed to achieve for many participants. This is what community looks like, Carol Brennan observed as she documented the gathering for her veteran support programs. People who understand each other's experience coming together to share burdens that are too heavy to carry alone. But the day's events had also attracted attention from sources beyond supportive veterans and local community members. Agent Walsh arrived at closing time, her expression showing frustration mixed with grudging respect for the political maneuvering that had complicated her investigation. Miss Martinez, as Sarah locked the store's front door, Congressman Harrison's intervention has created some complications for our recruitment efforts. Good, Sarah replied simply. However, it hasn't eliminated the fact that your capabilities are valuable for national security purposes. There are situations developing where your specific skills could save American lives. Sarah studied Agent Walsh's expression, recognizing the shift from coercive recruitment to something approaching genuine request. What kind of situations? The kind that require precision marksmanship under combat conditions, where failure means civilian casualties and terrorist propaganda victories. American hostages in hostile territory, terrorist cells planning attacks on civilian targets, situations where conventional military response isn't feasible, but special operations intervention could prevent significant loss of life. The folder's contents were compelling in ways that Sarah's moral code couldn't easily dismiss. These weren't abstract government operations, but specific missions where her capabilities could prevent the kind of losses she'd experienced in Operation Desert Sage. American lives that could be saved, terrorist attacks that could be prevented, families that could be spared the grief she carried for Maria Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and Jackson Williams. "What are you asking?" Sarah said, though she already understood the implications. Voluntary consultation on specific operations where your expertise could be decisive. Not full-time recruitment, not permanent obligation, but availability for missions where your capabilities could prevent significant loss of life.
Jake Patterson stepped forward from where he'd been waiting to drive Sarah home. What about her medical status? What about the PTSD diagnosis that qualified her for medical retirement? Military medical retirement doesn't eliminate operational capability, Walsh replied. It establishes that sustained combat deployment would be detrimental to her health. Short-term consultation on specific operations is different from long-term combat assignment. The distinction was important, both medically and legally. Sarah's capabilities were intact despite her post-combat trauma, but her psychological condition made extended deployment inadvisable. Episodic consultation would allow her to contribute her skills without subjecting her to the sustained stress that had triggered her medical retirement. "I need time to think," Sarah said finally. "Of course. But Ms. Martinez, the first operation we're requesting consultation on involves American hostages who were captured 3 days ago. Time constraints may not allow for extended deliberation." Agent Walsh left the mission folder and departed without further pressure, but her final words carried implications that would dominate Sarah's thoughts throughout the evening. American hostages in terrorists' hands, facing execution unless rescued by operations that might benefit from her specific expertise. The moral weight of potentially withholding capabilities that could save lives created pressure that community support couldn't address or resolve. That night, Sarah's routine at the kitchen window extended far beyond her usual 10 minutes. The mission folder lay open on her counter, satellite photographs and intelligence briefings describing a situation that bore uncomfortable similarities to the operation that had killed her teammates 18 months earlier. But this time, she wouldn't be deployed with a team. She would be providing consultation to planners who would execute the mission without risking her psychological stability through direct combat involvement. Maria, Tommy, Jackson, Rodriguez, Chen, Williams, Patel. The names she whispered carried different weight tonight, accompanied by new understanding of how their sacrifice could be honored. Using her capabilities to prevent other families from experiencing similar loss might transform survivor guilt into productive purpose, changing the meaning of her survival from burden to opportunity for service. But the decision couldn't be made in isolation. Sarah had accepted community support that created obligations to consider how her choices might affect people who demonstrated willingness to protect her. Accepting federal consultation might validate the recruitment approach that Congressman Harrison had criticized, potentially undermining political advocacy for other veterans facing similar pressure. The next morning brought Sarah to Morrison's Hardware with the mission folder and a decision that would require community input. She gathered her closest supporters, Bobby, Maria Santos, Jake, Carol, and Tom, to discuss options that went beyond her individual preferences to include broader implications for veteran rights and community autonomy. "They're asking for consultation, not deployment," she explained, showing them the mission briefings. "Helping plan operations that could save hostages without putting me back in combat situations that triggered medical retirement." Bobby studied the satellite photographs with professional interest. These are real operations with real consequences. American hostages who will be executed if rescue missions fail. But accepting consultation validates their claim that decorated veterans have ongoing obligations to government service. It could undermine Harrison's advocacy for veteran autonomy. Jake offered a different perspective. Or it could demonstrate that veterans can choose to serve again when the need is genuine and the terms are reasonable. Sarah making this choice voluntarily, with community support, is different from federal agents pressuring her into service. The discussion continued throughout the morning, weighing moral obligations against personal autonomy, individual capability against collective principle. Each perspective carried validity that made simple answers impossible, forcing Sarah to navigate competing loyalties and responsibilities that civilian life wasn't supposed to require. The resolution came when Tom Rodriguez made an observation that reframed the entire discussion. "Sarah, you've been carrying guilt for 18 months about teammates who died while you survived. What if this is a chance to honor their sacrifice by preventing other people from dying in similar situations? What if your survival was supposed to lead to this opportunity to save lives they can't save anymore?"
The insight transformed survivor guilt into purposeful mission, changing the meaning of Sarah's survival from random chance to providential opportunity. Her teammates' deaths had given her capabilities and experience that could prevent similar losses for other families, other communities, other military units facing impossible decisions under combat pressure. "I'll do the consultation," Sarah decided, "but on my terms, with community support and with clear understanding that this is voluntary service rather than compelled obligation." The decision triggered a series of events that would transform not just Sarah's life, but the entire community's understanding of how individual capability could serve collective good. Federal consultation became community project, with Morrison's Hardware serving as unofficial coordination center for supporting Sarah's return to limited service.
Carol Brennan established legal oversight to ensure that Sarah's voluntary consultation didn't become coercive recruitment. Jake Patterson provided tactical assessment to help evaluate whether proposed missions were genuine emergencies or routine operations that could be handled through normal military channels. Bobby Chen and Maria Santos created support systems to monitor Sarah's psychological stability during mission planning phases. The first consultation proved successful beyond anyone's expectations. Sarah's analysis of hostage rescue scenarios led to tactical modifications that allowed extraction of all 14 American captives without casualty to rescue forces or civilian bystanders. Her insights into sniper positioning and target prioritization prevented the kind of compromise that had killed her teammates in Operation Desert Sage. More importantly, the consultation process demonstrated that decorated veterans could serve national security interests without sacrificing personal autonomy or community connection. Sarah's voluntary participation, with clear limitations and community oversight, became a model for how federal agencies could request veteran expertise without resorting to coercive recruitment. The success attracted attention from military leadership and veteran advocacy groups nationwide, transforming Sarah's individual case into broader policy discussion about post-combat transition and voluntary military service opportunities. Congressman Harrison used her example to propose legislation that would formalize veteran consultation programs while protecting individual autonomy and requiring community support for any veteran accepting such responsibilities. What Sarah has accomplished here goes beyond individual success, Harrison announced during a visit to Copper Ridge 6 months later. She's demonstrated that communities can support their veterans while those veterans continue serving national security interests. This model could revolutionize how we approach post-combat transition and voluntary military service. The transformation extended beyond Sarah's individual circumstances to affect the entire Copper Ridge community. Morrison's Hardware became known throughout the region as a place where veterans could find support, understanding, and opportunities to use their capabilities for productive purposes. The shooting range where Sarah had first demonstrated her abilities was renamed the Desert Sage Memorial Range, honoring her fallen teammates while celebrating the possibility of using military skills for civilian protection and community service. 3 years after her arrival in Copper Ridge, Sarah Martinez had become something she'd never expected, a bridge between military capability and civilian need, a demonstration that extraordinary skills could be integrated with ordinary life through community support and voluntary service. Her teammates' names, whispered in grief for 18 months, had become inspiration for service that honored their sacrifice while building the kind of life they'd all hoped to achieve after military service. The hardware store employee who'd seemed lost at the shooting range had found her place not by hiding from her capabilities, but by accepting them as gifts that could serve purposes larger than individual survival. And the community that had offered protection when she was vulnerable discovered that their support had gained them something precious, proof that taking care of people revealed the best in everyone involved. 5 years later. The morning sun painted Morrison's Hardware in familiar golden light as Sarah Martinez unlocked the front door, her movements carrying the easy confidence of someone who'd found their place in the world. The shaking in her hands had stopped 3 years ago, replaced with steady purpose that extended beyond individual healing to encompass community leadership and national service. The store itself had evolved alongside Sarah's transformation. A new section displayed tactical and survival equipment, serving the growing community of veterans who'd relocated to Copper Ridge to benefit from the support systems that Sarah's case had inspired. The walls featured photographs from successful hostage rescues and terrorist interdiction operations where her consultation had prevented civilian casualties and saved American lives. Bobby Chen emerged from the office with morning coffee and the satisfied expression of someone whose faith in human potential had been repeatedly validated. "Congressional committee is meeting today about the Veteran Consultation Act," he announced.
Harrison thinks it'll pass with bipartisan support. The proposed legislation would formalize the program that had grown from Sarah's individual case, creating structures for voluntary veteran consultation that protected personal autonomy while enabling national security agencies to access specialized expertise when genuine emergencies arose. Sarah's successful integration of limited service with civilian life had become the model for policy that could benefit thousands of veterans struggling with post-combat transition. "Any word from the Peterson family?" Sarah asked, referring to the latest hostage situation where her consultation had contributed to mission planning. "All 4 family members rescued successfully, no casualties to rescue forces," Bobby replied with satisfaction. The father specifically asked to thank the sniper consultant whose tactical analysis made their extraction possible. Such gratitude had become routine, but Sarah never tired of knowing that her capabilities continued serving purposes that honored her fallen teammates. Each successful mission represented lives saved that Maria Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and Jackson Williams couldn't save themselves. Their sacrifice transformed into ongoing protection for families who would never know how close they'd come to tragedy. The morning brought its usual stream of customers, but these interactions carried deeper significance than simple retail transactions. Pete Kowalski stopped by for fence supplies, but also to discuss his nephew Steve's successful application to the Veteran Consultation Program. Maria Santos purchased office supplies while coordinating support services for 3 new veteran families who'd moved to Copper Ridge seeking the kind of community integration that Sarah had helped pioneer. "The documentary film crew wants to schedule interviews next week," Maria mentioned as Sarah rang up her purchases. "National Geographic is doing a piece about communities that support veteran transition through productive use of military capabilities." Sarah nodded acceptance, while privately marveling at how completely her life had been transformed. The woman who'd arrived in Copper Ridge, seeking anonymity and isolation, had become the subject of national media attention, congressional testimony, and academic research into post-combat healing through community integration and voluntary service. But fame, even positive recognition, carried challenges that required ongoing navigation. Agent Walsh, now promoted to deputy director of the federal program that had grown from Sarah's consultation work, arrived at noon with mission briefings that tested the boundaries between voluntary service and operational necessity. "We have a situation developing in Somalia. American aid workers captured by terrorist cells, execution scheduled for tomorrow unless ransom demands are met. The rescue operation could benefit significantly from your consultation." Sarah accepted the briefing folder with practiced efficiency, her capabilities fully integrated with decision-making processes that balanced personal autonomy against moral obligation. "Timeline for consultation input?"
6 hours for tactical analysis, then real-time communication during mission execution if you're willing to provide it. The request represented exactly the kind of voluntary service that the consultation program was designed to facilitate. Clear mission parameters, defined time commitment, genuine emergency circumstances, and explicit acknowledgement that Sarah's participation was requested rather than required. "I'll need community notification," Sarah said, implementing protocols that had evolved to ensure transparency and support for her consultation work. "Jake should review tactical elements, Carol needs legal oversight, and Tom should monitor stress indicators during mission phases." These requirements weren't bureaucratic obstacles, but protective measures that had proven essential for maintaining Sarah's psychological stability during consultation work. Community involvement ensured that her voluntary service remained genuinely voluntary while providing support systems that prevented isolation and overcommitment. The afternoon transformed Morrison's hardware into an informal command center as Sarah's support network mobilized to facilitate her consultation on the Somalia rescue operation. Jake Patterson reviewed satellite intelligence to confirm that the mission represented genuine emergency rather than routine operational support. Carol Brennan verified that legal protections remained intact and that Sarah's participation wouldn't create precedent for expanded federal claims on her time and capabilities. Tom Rodriguez established medical monitoring to ensure that consultation stress didn't trigger post-combat symptoms that could compromise Sarah's judgment or well-being. Bobby Chen coordinated communication with federal mission planners, ensuring that Sarah's tactical input was properly integrated while maintaining her status as voluntary consultant rather than operational asset. Hostage location confirmed in compound that matches your tactical assessment from the 2019 Yemen operation, Jake reported after reviewing reconnaissance data. Similar layout, comparable security measures, tactical challenges that align with your consultation expertise. Sarah studied the mission briefings with the focused intensity that had made her consultation invaluable for complex rescue operations. Her analysis identified sniper positions that could provide overwatch for extraction teams, security vulnerabilities that could be exploited for compound penetration, and tactical modifications that could prevent the kind of team casualties that had haunted her since Operation Desert Sage. Primary recommendation is modified approach vector to avoid detection, she dictated to Bobby, who relayed her tactical input to federal mission planners. Secondary positions for Overwatch teams should prioritize extraction support rather than assault participation. Tertiary consideration is civilian protection protocols if compound contains non-combatant personnel. The consultation continued throughout the afternoon, Sarah's expertise shaping mission parameters that would determine success or failure for the rescue operation. But unlike her previous military service, this consultation was supported by community involvement that prevented isolation and maintained connection to civilian life that gave her capabilities meaning beyond tactical effectiveness. As evening approached, Sarah prepared for real-time communication during mission execution, her role shifting from tactical consultant to operational advisor, who could provide immediate guidance if circumstances required tactical modification. The responsibility was significant, but community support made it manageable in ways that individual service had never achieved. Mission launch in 30 minutes, Agent Walsh reported via secure communication. Your tactical modifications have been implemented. Rescue teams are in position. Sarah settled into the communication center that Bobby had established in Morrison's office, surrounded by people whose presence reminded her that her capabilities served purposes larger than government missions. She was protecting aid workers whose dedication to helping others echoed the community spirit that had transformed her own life. She was honoring teammates whose sacrifice had given her the experience needed to prevent similar losses for other families.
Sierra 1, this is Overwatch, came the voice of the mission commander. Beginning approach to target compound, confirming modified vector per consultant recommendations. Sarah monitored radio communications while providing tactical guidance that had been proven effective through 3 years of successful consultation work. Her insights helped rescue teams navigate security challenges, avoid detection during compound approach, and maintain operational security that protected both hostages and rescue personnel. Contact, 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 reported the assault team leader. Multiple hostiles neutralized, hostages located and secured, extraction in progress. Overwatch confirms all clear for extraction route, Sarah responded, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of knowing that her tactical input was directly contributing to mission success. No additional threats detected on egress. 20 minutes later, Agent Walsh confirmed mission completion. All 4 aid workers rescued successfully. No casualties to rescue personnel. Mission success attributed significantly to consultant tactical modifications. Sarah accepted the confirmation with quiet satisfaction, another successful consultation that honored her teammates' sacrifice while serving humanitarian purposes that aligned with her personal values. The aid workers would return to their families, the rescue teams would go home safely, and terrorist propaganda would be denied the victory they'd sought through hostage execution. 10 years later, the dedication ceremony for the Veterans Consultation Center took place on a crisp October morning when the desert air carried promises of autumn cooling,
and the kind of clarity that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Sarah Martinez, now 38 and serving as director of the national program she'd helped pioneer, stood before an audience that included congressional representatives, military leadership, and dozens of veterans whose lives had been transformed by community-supported consultation opportunities. "When I arrived in Copper Ridge 11 years ago," Sarah said, her voice carrying easily across the crowd gathered outside the new facility, "I was running from capabilities I didn't know how to integrate with civilian life. This community taught me that extraordinary skills can serve ordinary purposes, that military training can build rather than destroy, and that the best way to honor fallen teammates is to use their sacrifice to protect other people's families." The Veterans Consultation Center represented the institutionalization of principles that had emerged from Sarah's case. Veterans with specialized capabilities could contribute to national security through voluntary consultation, while maintaining civilian careers and community connections that provided meaning beyond military service. The center offered medical support, legal protection, and community integration services that enabled sustainable volunteer service rather than the kind of isolated deployment that had triggered Sarah's original post-combat trauma. Congressman Harrison, now chairman of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, spoke about policy changes that Sarah's case had inspired. The Veteran Consultation Act has enabled more than 3,000 veterans to contribute their specialized skills to national security missions while building productive civilian lives. Sarah Martinez proved that supporting our veterans means more than providing medical care and employment assistance. It means recognizing that their capabilities are assets that can serve our communities and our country when they choose to offer that service. But the day's most significant moment came when families of veterans served by the consultation program shared stories about how community support and voluntary service had transformed post-combat trauma into purposeful civilian integration. Steve Kowalski, now a successful consultation program participant, spoke about how Sarah's example had shown him that elite military training could enhance rather than complicate civilian life when properly supported and voluntarily applied.
Sarah taught me that surviving combat wasn't something to hide from or be ashamed of, Steve said. She showed me that the capabilities we developed in military service could serve civilian purposes that honor our teammates and protect our communities. Jennifer Hayes, the former Navy SEAL who'd found courage to emerge from isolation through Sarah's public story, had become a wilderness rescue specialist whose tactical expertise had saved dozens of lives in mountain and desert emergencies. The consultation program gives us a way to be who we are without apologizing for what we've learned or hiding from what we've experienced. The afternoon brought Sarah to the restored shooting range, where her extraordinary marksmanship had first revealed capabilities that seemed incompatible with civilian anonymity. The Desert Sage Memorial Range now served as training facility for consultation program participants, its targets extending to ranges that challenged the most skilled marksmen while honoring the memory of Maria Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and Jackson Williams. Chuck Wilson, now in his 70s but still running the range with enthusiastic precision, watched Sarah demonstrate shooting techniques to a group of military veterans who were considering consultation program participation. "Still the finest shooting I've ever seen," he observed, as Sarah placed 10 shots through a single hole at 600 yards. "But now it serves purposes that those boys would be proud of." Sarah's capabilities had been enhanced rather than diminished by 11 years of consultation work and community integration. Her marksmanship remained at levels that impressed military professionals, but more importantly, her tactical expertise had been refined through application to rescue operations that saved civilian lives rather than eliminated military targets. "The key to successful consultation," Sarah explained to the veterans observing her demonstration, "is remembering that our capabilities serve humanitarian purposes. We're not returning to combat. We're using combat experience to prevent combat casualties and protect civilian populations."
The distinction was crucial for veterans struggling with post-combat trauma while recognizing that their specialized skills remained valuable for national security purposes. Consultation work provided outlet for capabilities that demanded expression while serving moral purposes that validated military sacrifice rather than simply extending it. Evening brought Sarah to the memorial garden that the community had created to honor veterans who'd contributed to consultation program success. Plaques remembered Maria Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, Jackson Williams, and other military personnel whose sacrifice had enabled the capabilities that now serve humanitarian missions. But the garden also celebrated living veterans whose voluntary service had prevented civilian casualties and terrorist victories through tactical expertise applied with community support and moral purpose. Sarah stood before the memorial plaque dedicated to her original sniper team, reading names she'd whispered in darkness for years, but now spoke with pride rather than guilt. Maria, Tommy, Jackson, you saved 14 lives in Desert Sage, and your sacrifice has enabled us to save hundreds more through consultation work. Your deaths weren't meaningless. They were the foundation for service that continues protecting people you never met in places you never saw. The transformation from survivor guilt to purposeful legacy had taken years to accomplish, supported by community integration and voluntary service that honored military sacrifice through humanitarian application. Sarah's capabilities, once source of isolation and trauma, had become instruments of protection and healing that served the values military service was supposed to defend. 15 years later, Sarah Martinez stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom for extraordinary contribution to national security through innovative volunteer service programs that have revolutionized veteran transition and saved hundreds of civilian lives through humanitarian missions. The ceremony represented official recognition of what the Copper Ridge community had understood for 15 years, that supporting veterans meant enabling them to use their capabilities for purposes that honored their service while building productive civilian lives.
Ms. Martinez exemplifies the highest ideals of American military service, the president said as he placed the medal around Sarah's neck. Her voluntary contributions to national security operations have prevented terrorist attacks, rescued hostages, and saved civilian lives while demonstrating that our veterans' capabilities remain valuable assets for protecting American interests and humanitarian values. But for Sarah, the medal's significance lay not in personal recognition, but in validation of principles that had grown from her individual case into national policy. The Veteran Consultation Program now operated in all 50 states, enabling thousands of veterans to contribute specialized skills to emergency operations while maintaining civilian careers and community connections that provided meaning beyond military service. The audience for the ceremony included many of the people whose support had made Sarah's transformation possible. Bobby Chen and Maria Santos, now co-directors of the Copper Ridge Veterans Support Center, represented the community integration that had enabled Sarah's healing and productive service. Jake Patterson and Carol Brennan, whose advocacy had protected Sarah from federal coercion, demonstrated the importance of civilian oversight for voluntary military service. Agent Walsh, now retired from federal service but continuing her advocacy for ethical veteran recruitment, spoke about how Sarah's case had transformed government approaches to accessing specialized military expertise. Sarah taught us that voluntary service is more effective than coercive recruitment, that community support enhances rather than complicates national security operations, and that respecting veterans' autonomy produces better outcomes than treating them as government assets. The ceremony concluded with Sarah's remarks about the future of veteran consultation and community integration. 15 years ago, I came to Copper Ridge seeking anonymity and isolation. This community taught me that extraordinary capabilities can serve ordinary purposes, that military training can build rather than destroy, and that the best way to honor fallen teammates is to use their sacrifice to protect other people's families.
She paused to acknowledge the audience members whose support had enabled her transformation. But none of this would have been possible without a community that chose to protect and support someone whose past was complicated and whose capabilities were frightening to people who didn't understand them. Copper Ridge proved that small towns can change national policy when they choose to care for individuals rather than judging them. The final surprise of the ceremony came when the president announced the establishment of the Martinez Center for Veteran Community Integration, a federal facility that would be located in Copper Ridge and would serve as the national headquarters for Consultation Program Administration and Veteran Support Services. It's appropriate that this center be located in the community that pioneered the integration model, the president explained. Copper Ridge has demonstrated that supporting our veterans requires more than government programs. It requires community commitment to helping extraordinary people build ordinary lives that honor their service while contributing to civilian purposes. That evening, Sarah returned to Morrison's Hardware for a community celebration that was more meaningful to her than the White House ceremony. The store had become a landmark in veteran advocacy, its walls displaying photographs from hundreds of successful consultation missions and testimonials from veterans whose lives had been transformed through community support and voluntary service. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Bobby Chen asked as he watched Sarah interact with veteran families who'd relocated to Copper Ridge seeking the kind of community integration that had become the town's signature contribution to national veteran policy. "What's that?" Sarah replied, accepting congratulations from Tom Rodriguez, whose medical monitoring had ensured her psychological stability through 15 years of consultation work. "That we figured out how to let you be exactly who you are, instead of trying to make you into someone else. That's what community is supposed to do. Help people become the best versions of themselves rather than forcing them to hide their capabilities or deny their experience."
The observation captured the essence of what Copper Ridge had accomplished through Sarah's case. Rather than asking her to choose between her military past and civilian future, the community had helped her integrate both into a life that served humanitarian purposes while maintaining personal autonomy and community connection. As the celebration continued into the desert night, Sarah found herself surrounded by the extended family that had grown from her individual case into a nationwide movement for veteran support and community integration. The hardware store employee who'd seemed lost at the shooting range had found her place as a bridge between military capability and civilian need, between individual trauma and community healing, between extraordinary skills and ordinary purposes that honored military sacrifice while building the kind of life that service was supposed to protect. The names she'd whispered in grief for so many years had become inspiration for service that extended far beyond her individual capabilities. Maria Rodriguez, Tommy Chen, and Jackson Williams lived on through every life saved by consultation missions, every veteran successfully integrated into supportive communities, and every family spared the kind of loss that had shaped Sarah's understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the meaning of survival. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, and new veterans seeking the kind of community support that had transformed Sarah's trauma into purposeful mission. But tonight, in the desert town that had chosen to protect a stranger with dangerous capabilities and painful secrets, Sarah Martinez celebrated the revolutionary discovery that extraordinary people could build ordinary lives when communities chose love over fear, support over judgment, and integration over isolation. The shooting range where she'd first revealed her capabilities now served veterans from across the nation, each one seeking proof that military training could enhance rather than complicate civilian life. The hardware store where she'd found employment continued serving the practical needs of a community that had learned to value both ordinary commerce and extraordinary capability in service of humanitarian purposes. And in the memorial garden where her teammates' names were honored alongside hundreds of other veterans whose sacrifice had enabled ongoing service, Sarah knew that survival wasn't random chance, but providential opportunity to transform individual trauma into collective healing, personal capability into community protection, and military sacrifice into civilian service that honored the values military service was supposed to defend. The desert stars stretched endlessly above Copper Ridge,
bearing witness to a community that had changed national policy through the simple act of caring for one person whose story needed telling, whose capabilities deserved support, and whose trauma required healing rather than judgment. Sarah Martinez had come home not by hiding from her past, but by integrating it with a future that served purposes larger than individual survival, creating a legacy that would protect families she'd never meet in places she'd never see, using capabilities that honored teammates whose sacrifice had made such service possible.